It's a good time to kick off. So hello and welcome to the Young Fabians Environment Network panel discussion tonight on DEFRA, the future of environment policy and the effect of COVID-19 on global sustainability. The pandemic is indisputably a tragedy in that it has brought around such a loss of human life, economic devastation and destabilized international development as well as aid. However, it may inadvertently pave the way for a schema of substantially more sustainable living. And you may have seen that Labour has very recently announced unapologetically ambitious plans for a green economic recovery, coordinated by Ed Miliband and Annalise Dodds. It's great to see such thought leadership from the party. And meanwhile, we've got Sadiq Khan repurposing London in a car-free initiative, showing how coronavirus can in fact be a catalyst for long-term change. Now more than ever, we need to reinvigorate our pursuit of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, invest in green transitions rather than resuscitating the oil industry, and ensure we meet net zero emissions targets to lead by example in global decarbonisation efforts. So thank you very much to our speakers tonight for joining us. We've got Luke Pollard, MP for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and Shadow Secretary of State for Food, Environment and Rural Affairs, as well as Joe Blackman, Head of Forests Policy and Advocacy at international NGO Global Witness and Labour Councillor for Redbridge to speak on these issues. So I'll hand over to Luke and then Joe for opening remarks, after which we've got some questions for both, and a Q&A will subsequently open up to the floor. Please could you put your questions in the Zoom chat and we'll come to you to ask them yourselves. So without further ado, Luke, if you'd like to begin.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really good to be able to continue the work that I was doing since the general election. You may recall in December, sadly, we lost 5 out of our 6 shadow DEFRA ministers, including Sue Hayman, who had done so much work to pioneer DEFRA policies in her role as Environment Secretary before the election. And so the opportunity to serve Keir and the Shadow Cabinet with a new DEFRA team has been fantastic. And it is great to work alongside so many people that are passionate about not only the environment, but also getting into the weeds about where we are on food policy, on agriculture, on fisheries, and on air quality. Areas that I think the Labour Party's had this on and off relationship with. We've regarded much of what DEFRA does as a technical pursuit for quite some time. So as a party, we have good, chunky, quite comprehensive policies on air quality and on farming and on fisheries. But actually, one of the bits we've missed, I think, has been that raw emotional feel, that political imperative as to why do these things matter, and the connection of an increasingly urbanized membership to why rural matters, why coastal matters really should be taken more seriously as a party. And I think the introduction that you gave about the virus changing things is certainly true, because the party's using this line at the moment, which I like, that we can't go back to business as usual. And I like the second line that goes, because business as usual wasn't working. For some reason, that's too many characters to appear on tweets, but you get the sense of it, that actually the desire that lots of us have, and you will find yourself having said this recently about, I wish things would return to normal, being cooped up in flats, not being able to see friends and family, not being able to do the things that we otherwise would be doing because of the virus, does make us want to get back to normal. But actually, we need to build back better. We need to recognize that there is no going back to where we were before. And even if there was a possibility of being able to do that, our period in lockdown, I think, has given us a newfound focus on what's important. What's important to you now is probably very different to what was important to you 2 months ago. What's important to families right across the country has now changed. And if you think about some of those DEFRA issues that really matter, the fact that food supply was plentiful beforehand for most people, but we went through a period where there were empty shelves. So food is now a political issue. It should have been for quite some time. Labour's been trying to make food a political issue for many years. And it's been something that's been worthy and important to do. And our pressure around food banks and about the nutritional quality of food, the obesity crisis, have all been worthwhile and important. But now we have this opportunity to put food policy on the front line in a way that we haven't had for quite some time. And that newfound focus on the availability, the quality, the backstory of food, including all those incredible people that work not only in retail but in supply and distribution, but on our farms, in food factories, and who catch fish, needs to be part of that story as well. And if we extend that logic into air quality, because we know that for many people that are recovering from coronavirus, they are emerging from the virus with diminished lung capacity, which means the air that we breathe is going to be even more important to addressing where we are coming from. And that is the kind of challenge that I think we've got to face as a society. And as a party, I think we have to do a lot more to step up some of the debate. Now, I love the way you introduced me at the start as the Shadow Secretary of State for Food, Environment and Rural Affairs, because actually I'd much prefer we had that focus on the word food in my job title and in what we do. Because when I'm positioned as the Shadow Environment Secretary, unfortunately, due to the way that governments put climate in with the Department for Business, it means that you get all the focus on the environment on the DEFRA brief, but actually large chunks of what we need to do to decarbonise, to really radically transform our economy sits with business. And actually, if we delve under it deeper, actually the transport emissions sit with DFT. The housing emissions and the emissions from buildings in general is spread across government, but MHCLG takes large chunks of that. That's why we need an approach that isn't just keeping the climate crisis, that doesn't just put environmental responsibility in one department. We need to share it across the entire movement. And for me, one of the key bits that I want to see us do over the next few months is kind of repurpose elements of what the Labour Party stands for to be unashamedly red on the outside, but green on the inside. And that means that we need to have that same type of approach to building back better that works in education and health just as much as it does in housing and transport. And we need to actually make what DEFRA does, what Environment, Food and Rural Affairs does, mean much more. We need to put that political angle on it, because if we look at the seats we have to win back at the next general election, and many of those contests in local government, well, many of those marginal seats are now coastal. Many of those marginal seats actually include quite large rural communities. And as a party, we haven't always been there in those rural communities in the way that we perhaps would want to have been. Now, the biggest challenge that we've got here is we've just got to turn up. We've got to be present. We've got to listen. We've got to advocate, and we've got to organise in those communities, both rural, coastal and urban, because the divide between rural and urban is not as big as we sometimes think it is. And if you are concerned about not being able to feed your family, well, you'd be concerned about that whether you live in an isolated rural community or whether you live in a tower block in one of the densely populated cities in the country. You know, if you're concerned about, you know, your kids growing up and not being able to breathe clean air, well, you're probably as concerned about that in living on a busy road in rural communities as you are in urban communities. We need to break down the barriers between urban and rural. And if we do that psychologically on policy, we can do that on how we win back, because we're not going to be able to win back many of those communities that we lost in 2019, 2017 and 2015, let alone the ones we lost in 2010. We'll need to win back many of those, majority of those, if we are to form the next government at the general election. We've got to do that recognising that simply appealing to urban voters is not going to be enough. And that's why our message as a party has to have an appeal to rural and coastal communities, just as it does to those people that live in towns and cities. Now, that means an awful lot of looking again. It means an awful lot of listening to those communities that we haven't always spoken for. But actually, if you look at where the Conservatives are at the moment, you know, Labour values and rural values, Labour values and coastal values, well, they're one and the same. We might not always win elections in those seats, but there's a greater alignment of where we are on policy with those communities, on large chunks of what we stand for in our manifesto than there has ever been. And I think the virus is grim, and it sadly will continue to get worse before it gets better, I fear. but we need to make sure that in learning the lessons of what the virus is telling us, what it is exposing in our communities and what it is creating, the economic difficulties and social difficulties it's creating, we need to have a vision about what type of country we want to be. And for me, this goes back to our fundamentals. After a huge election defeat like we had in December, we need to look again and say, why are we here? And actually, for me, I believe strongly that Labour is a force for good. We need to be a positive force for good in our communities and on the global stage. And that is a purpose that fits really well with what Britain's role needs to be. And I think if we start looking at that, then we can get into, the rising food poverty that we're seeing exponentially grow in rural and urban communities. We can get into the necessity to deal with polluted air. We can get into the fact that if you live in some of our poorest communities, actually, some of our most deprived communities now are not just in big cities. They're in small towns, they're in coastal communities, and there's areas of rural deprivation that would challenge any of our major cities in terms of the challenges there. Now, none of this is good, but we need to make sure that as a party, we are listening to those communities, building our policies and a narrative that comes from it. And I think there's opportunities for our party to win back support in those areas and put the government that we're going to have, like it or not, for the next few years under pressure to make better decisions. Now, I'd love us to go into, and hopefully we'll soon, about the priority around tree planting, the priority around biodiversity, the priority around reforming the way that our land use is done, both in urban and rural areas. And we need to go into all of that, but it needs to stem from a place that has politics attached to it much more. That's not partisan politics necessarily. That's about saying it matters, food matters. So we are going to have it as an area on our political agenda. And we're going to say what happens in coastal communities does matter. And we are going to listen and engage with it much more. Now, that is the recipe that takes us towards recovery in those communities, which is what we need if we're going to win. But it also is what we need if we're going to try and address some of the deep-seated poverty that we see in those communities at the same time. So that's probably a quick run round about what's going on in the team. Just finally to say that I'm really pleased that it's not just me and the Shadow DEFRA team. We've got Lloyd Russell-Moyle, who is leading on air quality, with a brief that I've given him to make sure that air quality isn't just a technical response about particulate matter. It's one that breeds social justice into it, because we can't have social justice without environmental justice, and vice versa. It's not good enough that only the middle classes can afford to decarbonise. We need that to be available to everyone. Steph Peacock is leading on water and on flooding, and those communities that were flooded out just before the floods, well, many of those people have still not been able to return home because of the way that flood response is dealt with in the country. And we've got Daniel Zeichner, the Cambridge MP, who's leading on food and farming. And collectively, that's a really strong team with Ruth Jones as the team's PPS. So really proud of the team that we've got, and look forward to answering some of your questions shortly.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more in terms of a very, very strong team. And as Luke has referenced, he wrote a really excellent article, red on the outside, green on the inside, so do check it out. And he is the most credible person to speak about that importance of rural communities, given he's kind of an island of red in an otherwise sea of blue, in terms of the seats that we've lost. So on to you, Joe, on your thoughts, a bit of background, maybe a bit about Global Witness, which is such an important organisation that I massively admire.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Cecilia, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Luke, for that really interesting overview of where Labour sits on UK environmental issues at the moment. My background is very much in the Labour Party. I worked for various Labour parliamentarians over the years. Indeed, Luke and I overlapped in the House of Commons about 15 years ago, which is maybe showing our age. And I've also worked at Labour Party head office and worked for a couple of NGOs, and I'm a local Labour councillor, as Cecilia said. So I think I've got quite an, I take a view of kind of local, national and global as well. And what I really wanted to talk about this evening is really the importance of the UK's global environmental policy and why that matters so much for UK domestic concerns as well, and why that's really something the Labour Party and UK government should really be championing. So the organisation I work for is called Global Witness. I've worked there for nearly 5 years, and I oversee our global deforestation campaign. And a small team of campaigners based across London, Brussels, Washington DC and China. We're a global anti-corruption and human rights NGO, and we work to expose corruption, human rights, and environmental destruction. And we campaign to change the systems that enable them to happen. So our model, what makes us different from other organisations, is that we undertake detailed investigations, unearthing wrongdoing on the ground where natural resources are being exploited, looking at both its environmental and human impacts. And so alongside my team of campaigners, we've also got a team of investigators who are doing in-depth, often undercover investigations on the ground and looking at the companies and the financing involved. So what we do is we look at the whole ecosystem behind environmental destruction. We look at the key players, we look at the global supply chains, and we look at the financing that really enables it all to happen. And then we use that information to advocate for policy and legislative change to stop the destruction and to hold companies to account. And while we in that way contribute to corporate accountability by exposing wrongdoing, we actually also understand the systemic nature of the challenge we face and the behaviours which really require similarly a systemic and regulatory solution at scale usually. So some of our historic campaigns include exposing the trade in conflict minerals, so-called blood diamonds, and also in the timber trade, where the global trade fueled conflicts in places like Colombia, Cambodia, Liberia, and Zimbabwe. And we've also been influential in the establishment of the Kimberley process for diamonds, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EU timber regulation, and other regulation governing responsible regulation of minerals. So yeah, as I said earlier, I think what I want to talk about tonight is the global environmental questions. And for me, obviously what relates most directly to my role is the question of global deforestation. And I think some of the issues that Luke talked about are very much intrinsically tied to global systems, and they therefore require UK government to take this global leadership role in order to tackle them. So just one example being supply chains. You know, as Luke said, we're more acutely aware of those now, whereas before we might have taken it for granted that you know, a good was on the shelf and we needed it. Now we're aware that isn't necessarily the case, and so there's maybe more interest and attention on supply chains. And I think what we're finding as well is that those supply chains and those companies that are more resilient on environmental, social and governance issues are generally more resilient in times of economic crisis as well. So this sort of, you know, so measures that strengthen the global environment and improve supply chains are actually, you know, really important for economic reasons as well for those companies and our economies. So in terms of deforestation, as you're no doubt aware, tropical forests are really crucial in tackling climate change. They store and absorb carbon emissions and play a really crucial role in the regulation of the global climate. They're also really crucial for biodiversity, with tropical forests being home to about 80% of the world's species. So recently we've been hearing more about why the destruction of forests is so critical for human health. So while the precise route of transfer of COVID-19 is unknown, what we do know is biodiversity loss is closely associated with zoonoses. So those are diseases that pass from animals to humans. And believe it or not, they account for more than 70% of new emerging diseases in humans. And one of the leading drivers of this biodiversity loss is indeed deforestation, particularly associated with industrial agriculture. So I think that gives us an even stronger reason to be considering action on global deforestation. So as many on this call will be aware as well, that the expansion of the agricultural industry to feed global markets has really played a key role in fueling this deforestation. That's in particular products like soy, palm oil and beef, which find their way onto the global markets and are fueled by global finance as well. But sadly, their production leads to devastating deforestation and also devastation for all the communities that rely on these forests as well. So in one of Global Witness's reports just last year, we actually looked at the financing for 6 of the most harmful agribusiness companies directly or indirectly involved in deforestation. And what we found was really surprising, actually, even for us, that UK-based financial institutions were actually the biggest single source of finance for these companies. So they provided what we identified as £5 billion over 6 years to these companies. So So that's, really highlights the key role of the UK, not just in supply chains, but also in financing. So we're hearing good rhetoric from business on deforestation, and they're all very good at their green PR, but sadly what we're seeing isn't matching that. Many global brands committed to eliminating deforestation from their supply chains by 2020, and you'd think this was given added impetus by the global outrage at the fires in the Amazon last summer, but sadly not. Most of these brands, including Cargill and Nestle, are now admitting they won't meet the targets. And in any analysis of company policies on deforestation, they fall very short, sadly. So faced with this corporate failure to tackle deforestation, we're seeing increasing calls for government action. And we're also seeing some positive developments in the UK and EU. So what's our specific ask for the UK government? Well, we think that really greater clarity from the world's biggest consumer markets like the UK, that they will not tackle deforestation in their supply chains, could really send a crucial message to countries and to companies as well. What we believe is that it should be mandatory for businesses to undertake due diligence checks on their supply chains and investments to identify, mitigate, prevent and report on deforestation risks. So due diligence is a practice which is routinely undertaken on commercial risks, and indeed the OECD and UN have both developed best practice guidelines for how it can be undertaken for environment and human rights impacts. And even and kind of significantly for policy development on this in the UK was a UK government task force just recently reported. It's called the Global Resources Initiative, and it recently reported to the UK government, and there's a lot of corporate actors on there, so it's not just NGO types. And one of their main conclusions was that the UK government should urgently introduce this mandatory due diligence, and that was really the most crucial thing the government could do to tackle deforestation. So the government's due to respond to that report in autumn, and we're also aware, and Luke probably is as well, there's been some discussion on this issue through the Environment Bill. So the MPs raised various concerns in the debates and in the Bill Committee, and Labour MP Kerry McCarthy has also put down an amendment which would introduce mandatory due diligence. We also know Annalise Dodds is really keen on it, and actually frontbench Labour support is really important, as is Labour working with the Conservative government on this. And we'd appreciate any support that Luke can offer to try and get this taken up more widely. So as I said, research is showing that businesses that take account of these risks are more resilient in turbulent times. And we've certainly seen that from some of the early stages of the COVID-19 as well. So yeah, in summary, as I set out, Global Witness does what we can do through our investigations and campaigns work to hold companies to account through our investigations and mapping of global supply and investment chains. But ultimately, we know that these are systemic issues and they really require a systemic response. And that's why we believe that regulatory action is urgently needed to ensure corporate accountability on environmental harm and human rights abuses. And we know that that's crucial, not just for the environment, but also for UK citizens and voters whose well-being and health and the future of the environment and their supply chains is also intrinsically linked to the health and well-being of the forests, of the ecosystems, of biodiversity and the planet. So I'll wrap up there, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Jo. It was a really great speech on kind of the intrinsic links and how systemic all of these kind of inequalities and issues that we face, from the zoonotic disease that COVID-19 has even sprung from, to the supply chains that Luke has mentioned, and even how it just affects us as individuals, and what the UK can do to be that leader and lead by example in global decarbonisation efforts. So actually on that individual and corporate accountability, my first question was on Crispin Odey. He's one of the largest Conservative Party donors, to the tune of 1.7 million. He's invested more than $170 million into SLC Agricola, which, as you'll know, is one of Brazil's most damaging agribusinesses and responsible for deforestation in the Amazon. despite receiving several environmental fines. My take on that is that these fines are just not working. So in this case and generally, how can we hold such individuals and organisations to account, especially with such prominent links to our own government? Open to both panellists and respond well.
Shall I chip in? Is that all right, Luke? It was, so yeah, in terms of, that's an interesting one you picked up on, as you're probably aware, Cecilia, that was off the back of an investigation that we did. And that actually came out of the report we did where we looked at the financing of these 6 companies and found plenty of household name banks, as well as OD's investment company. So that was the story that was published in the FT just a couple of weeks ago when we issued a kind of follow-up, a slightly deeper dive on his investments. I think what was really striking was well, first the story itself, and then he responded very vigorously and got in touch directly with the journalists and sent an email quote where he was obviously really rattled, but his response was really telling, and this was covered in the FT as well. So what he referred to the fines that this company had received, he referred to them as parking fines. You know, he said these are like parking fines. You know, they've been it was, you know, saying it was totally overblown. He also said it was just a few bad people doing a few bad things. And for me, it was really telling, because I think it showed, first of all, how little financiers like him really care about environmental impacts. And then it secondly also showed, I think, you know, quite how small those fines are. So it was $2 million fines. And I think there's a strong argument to have a bigger impact. They need to be much bigger. And for me as well, you know, there is, like I say, it's part of this bigger systemic thing. So you can obviously go for your high profile financiers and get some headlines and prove the point and hopefully kind of toxify some of those investments. But the fact is that at the moment, for financiers investing in projects like that, there's not enough financial deterrent for them to do that, because they're not paying the true costs of the environmental impacts of their investment. They're just reaping the benefits without paying the costs. So I think you've really got to put the fines up significantly. And I think that's why I keep coming back to this point of regulation, because you need regulation that makes it too difficult for those companies to ignore the environmental concerns. And that's by this mandatory due diligence obligation. I think you've also got to put this information about financing in the public domain. At the moment, it's behind, you know, you need to get a Bloomberg terminal, you need to have some financial expert that can help you assess it. And it's, you know, it shouldn't be that way, because people need to scrutinise where the financing is coming from, particularly if you're a community whose forest has been destroyed and you've been kicked off your land. You need to find a way of tracing that back through the global system.
Luke, would you like to come in on this?
Well, I think Joe's answer's been quite comprehensive on the case itself. I mean, this individual who famously bet against British businesses and their share price taking a tumble with Brexit, I think is not always the best advert for British business. And I think there's a need, I think, when we are looking at what the UK's global role is I think to start to take a step back from the specifics we've just spoken about, in the respect that we're a country at the moment which is on an uncertain path. We don't really know which direction we're going in. Now, that's partly because our political leaders have laid out sometimes contradictory, sometimes difficult, uncertain blancmanges of futures. And as a result, there's I think a hesitation sometimes and a deference that we have to business leaders. But I think we need to start from sometimes our first principles about where we are here, about what type of country do we want to be? What is our global role? Now, whether you think Brexit was a great thing or not, and certainly I have strong views on it, there's no denying that this is putting the country at a crossroads about where we want to go. And that is certainly true about what is our international role, about, you know, how vocal will we be on environmental matters, how vocal will we be on sustainable financing, how vocal will we be on what type of business behaviour is regarded as acceptable in the 21st century. And I think at the moment the government has chosen not to have a view on those things. And I think it's up to those on the left, and the Labour Party in particular, to start forming a worldview which is in plain English and can be backed by people who voted Remain and Leave about what is our global role. And that's why in my remarks I talked about us being a force for good. Because if we are to be a force for good, which I think has the merits of being a moral purpose, something that we can all get behind, and also points towards a destination, well, that precludes certain types of business behaviour. That means that there are certain types of activities that we don't think we should be doing as a country, that we shouldn't be financing and supporting. And that is, I think, really important, because if we don't have that type of moral imperative, that kind of like moral journey about where we are on environmental matters, about, you know, what type of funding, how should people use our financial markets, then we just will continue to be in a situation where frankly, large bits of dark finance that goes through our financial institutions and our financial system supports activities which we want to oppose internationally. And I think we need to recommit ourselves to that, because at the moment we seem to be on a path of kind of exiting multilateralism, exiting some of those global leadership roles that we had in before. Now, it's all fine, well and good to have good, warm, positive, green sound bites. You know, the proof of the pudding comes in the tasting, and in terms of policy, that comes about whether we are supporting businesses, supporting that type of journey in the future. And I think, you know, there are examples that I think we need to learn from. And I think as the country is finding its feet in this new brave world outside the European Union, we need to make sure that the principles of our path that we're going to be treading in the future are set early and are set now, really, about what type of ethical behavior, what type of purpose, what type of role we want to have in the world. And that's got to have a green, sustainable core at it, in my mind. And that's a bigger picture that doesn't sit in DEFRA, it doesn't sit in the Foreign Office, it doesn't sit in any one particular department. But if it did, it might be easier to respond to it, actually. But because it is a grand strategy that, frankly, the UK has not really had for many, many decades, it's going to require a kind of national debate that brings up ideas. But I can't imagine that in the middle of that national debate, we are supporting those businesses that have the worst environmental records. Some of them are British. Some of them are owned by British companies. That's why we've got to use our role, I think, to kind of encourage different business behaviour, and where businesses don't move business behaviours, divestments, especially of those pension funds and those financial institutions that we as voters, as citizens, have a stake in.
Absolutely. Some great points from both. I think, you know, Luke, as you said earlier, it's kind of something, the climate movement and climate change as an issue is something that transcends politics so much. It's rather than party politics, the Conservatives eventually, they're going to face this too. They just have more of a shield than the average person in the global south might. And as Joe picked up on, it is all about regulation. And as Luke said, just Labour needs to become synonymous with a green recovery, with a green movement, and kind of use that grassroots momentum, keep that diplomatic momentum going. And yeah, the cognitive dissonance that Joe sort of brought up about how people like OD can just believe that what they're doing is fine, that they're not really financing such devastation, and that those fines need to turn into regulation to make it impossible to ignore. So my next question was basically, on a more macrocosmic scale, it has to be said that there's quite a black hole of awareness of who and what the key global climate criminals are. Kind of as Luke said, those financial institutions that we don't want to be supporting. For example, Amin H. Nasser of Saudi Aramco, Mike Worth of Chevron, Alexei Miller from Gazprom. That's just the three top CEOs, which are the contributors to the top three contributors to GHG emissions, both private investor and state-owned. So the media will report the government's scientific advisor's private life, which we've probably all seen, but not the organizations who commit ecocide on an international scale. So how can we raise awareness of the destruction they're causing, and what policies could be enacted to create that accountability?
I'll jump in first on this one here in that case, and let you follow on, Joe. Do you know what? It's a really good challenge, really, and the answer doesn't neatly fit into a soundbite. And if you do get an answer that fits into a soundbite, you need to interrogate that person that gave that rubbish answer, because if you're looking at those, like the 100 most polluting companies on a global scale, well, if you actually look at what those companies are doing, they're not just polluting for the sake of polluting. They are polluting in the process of making a product or delivering a service. And what we have to do, if we are to fundamentally transform it, is create a level of consumer demand, of civic demand, that changes the nature of that. Now, there does need to be stuff that I think moves us away from a carbon economy at a faster pace, and that needs to be a combination of both incentives and regulatory pressure and international action to do so. But there also needs to be consumer pressure in terms of doing that. And actually, you can't stack up, consumer pressure and put it against big corporations and say one will deliver the others, because that won't be the case. Consumer pressure for some consumers, regulatory pressure, political pressure, international coordination, and examples where the business has changed. So the market's changed. So therefore the money has moved to a different part of the market, or the political acceptability of a product has changed. All of those needs to be used as part of the toolboxes that we need to decarbonize effectively the efforts that we're going on. And that needs to come with a much greater, I think, political leadership about where we need to be. Because one of the reasons that oil companies are so polluting is because we still use lots of oil. Right? If we were in a situation where there was readily available alternatives, then we wouldn't be using as much oil. We wouldn't be using the products that they're providing. And that also has to come down to the political acceptability of what they're doing. So fracking's a really good example of that. Not on the companies that you necessarily used in your examples, but look at the political acceptability of fracking in the US compared to the UK. Now, look at the regulatory pressures that we have applied in different areas. Now, admittedly, for many of the fracking projects in the US, it's more state-level decision rather than a federal level. But actually, the campaigns against those organisations, well, they've been led, yes, by big national campaigns, but actually, in many cases, by local communities that are saying, we don't want this in our community. And we can't underestimate within that just the power of people organising at a local level, because there are very few of us, frankly, in Parliament or certainly on the Zoom call, that have the power in ourselves to enact this mega change that we need on a global scale, and we need to recognise that. And partly that's because if you do recognise that, then you need to recognise the path to getting that mega change comes from our ability to organise, our ability to coalesce, our ability to campaign advocates and advocate on those issues. And some of that starts with local action in terms of where those projects go, where we are looking at alternatives about where we get to. Now, that sounds like a really weak answer. And if I was asking me that question, I would go, well, you're trying to say that we need a local jumble sale to stop climate change. Well, the answer to everything in politics is always and rather than or. So we both need people to realise that they themselves, through their actions and their role, can influence others, which has a chance to influence others, which has a chance to influence others, just as much as we need a small number of incredibly super rich, very powerful companies to adjust their behaviours. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's not one silver bullet that we're not looking at. There's not one thing that governments could do. They have to work in tandem. They have to work on a basis that is supported by the people, and they have to work on a basis that has a clear goal that can be supported. And I think one of the frustrations for me around what the virus has produced is the delay in COP26 in Glasgow, because that would have been a moment where, especially the global south, would have been able to articulate a case on climate which has an urgency and a necessity that hasn't been heard for a while. Now, delaying COP26 a year off, my worry about it is that will produce not a year of further inquiry and agreement on some of the really genuinely difficult areas of agreement between nations and different political perspectives, but it's just going to produce a year of dither. Well, actually, we need to use this year to really get into the nuts and bolts about how you achieve the journey towards political change. And that does mean that we need to look at things differently. But as an example of the power that we all need to have, I mentioned pensions on a call with Young Fabians, and I realised the idea of pensions is somewhat further away from you than it is for me and my increasingly grey hair. But actually, if I look at my pension as an MP, well, the parliamentary pension scheme still invests in companies that, given free choice, I wouldn't want my pension invested into. So there is still political pressure that folks like myself and Labour MPs in Westminster, but we are applying to the pension scheme trustees, trying to get that changed. But actually that works whether you got your pension with a parliamentary scheme or whether you got a pension with Aviva or whatever. There are things that we all need to do through our own pressure that coalesce and builds together, because apparently by the strength of our common endeavour we achieve more together than we can alone. And that is certainly true whether that's about campaigning against inappropriate road building, campaigning for protection of biodiversity in your local community, or campaigning against really mega industrial projects that are going to destroy landscapes. All of those require us to work together to go and to kind of get there.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a really good point about the acceptability being the kind of the epicenter of how that paradigmatic change is going to happen. And we will get on to divestment soon in terms of how money is so political, and something that I think the average person without a specific political interest may not realize what they're inadvertently contributing to. But yeah, Joe, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that question as well.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and I think Luke touched on some really important issues there as well. So I think I was kind of mulling over this point about communities mobilising, and I think there are some sort of glimmers on that. I think we are seeing some shifts in perception of these companies and what's seen as socially acceptable in terms of art galleries and theatres moving away from sponsorship from BP and Shell, for example. But I think the problem is that these companies and their leaderships are too often outside of the reach of communities. And I'm talking about communities where their operations are directly impacting those communities, but also the kind of consumer side and the kind of consumer country activist groups as well. They kind of built these structures around themselves, particularly around these company leaderships, and the amount that's spent on marketing as well and greenwashing, that really kind of means that they managed to be quite immune to a lot of this, and they do more or less operate without full scrutiny. And I just, then you think, well, how do you hold them and these companies to account? And there's obviously regulatory action, which I was talking about before, but I do think there's something in also like identifying individuals associated with these companies as well. When I started at Global Witness, it was actually one of the things that made me quite uncomfortable with some of our reports we did, because we go for individuals. If we find a boss of a company who is personally profiting off the environmental destruction, all the corruption involved in the stuff we've uncovered, we'll name them. And we do have a good team of lawyers specialising in libel risk, so we don't get ourselves in too much trouble. Touch wood, so far so good. But I start to sort of I saw the value in that, because you're making it stick. Like if people realise their personal reputation is on the line, and their families are affected, and their family, they might often have kids at private school and in the West, and especially when we're going for some of the people involved in these kleptocratic regimes, then that stuff that does work. And I think you can, whether or not you can get the stuff to pin on some of the people you were talking about, I don't know, but I do think there's something about this individual responsibility and accountability for corporate behaviour. And I recently, when we were developing our policy around this mandatory due diligence approach, I was looking at other legislation that has requirements for businesses to be held to account for their corporate behaviour. And actually, one of the really interesting things that comes out is the ones that are effective are sometimes the ones where they require a company to name an individual as being responsible for overseeing that policy. So anti-money laundering is one, for example. and I met a friend of a friend a few months ago who he was actually the named individual responsible for that within his law firm. And that is one way to make your senior management, take seriously the risks and their obligations. And, so what we did, by looking at this question of individual accountability, we've developed a bit more thinking about how you could build that into a due diligence regime, which is requiring companies and named individuals at a senior level in those companies to be responsible for reporting on the risk, for identifying the risk, preventing it, all that set of behaviours as a way of shifting corporate responsibility. And I think that's the challenge, is kind of finding some way to cut through some of these like layers of marketing and legislation and the stuff that's created around these companies and the financial system as well, that makes them immune for the moment from that scrutiny and that accountability for environmental wrongdoing as well. But it's not easy. It's a good question.
Joe, can I be cheeky and jump in and ask you, because I love the idea of having individuals personally responsible for stuff in terms of transparency, because there is no doubt that if you are personally responsible for something, it's just like, if you're working on a group project and someone puts an action with your name against it, there's no escape from it. You're allocated for it. And actually, that's not something that we do in terms of the carbon responsibility or biodiversity protection in the UK in the way that perhaps we could do. A company secretary has to sign off for a set of accounts and an auditor has to say it's been audited. But actually, I have a huge problem with the way that our carbon market works, because I'm not entirely convinced carbon offsets are as good as they could be, shall we say. But actually, if there was someone who is responsible for that named in legislation, that would drive enormous behaviour change. Is that a sense that you get, not just in terms of kind of like activities around modern slavery and in terms of corporate malfeasance and bribery, but actually in terms of really looking at the responsibility around carbon that could work there, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've not looked at it so much in relation to carbon. I share your scepticism about carbon markets, to be honest. But I think, I was looking also at modern slavery, actually, and they had an independent review that reported one of their recommendations was to, I think, allocate individual responsibility. I might be wrong. And there was discussion basically within the review about the fact that it's whether it should be a collective board responsibility versus individual. And precisely because, precisely as you said, it's more effective if it's individual, but obviously there's likely to be more resistance from that. But yeah, the thing we looked at with anti-money laundering was quite interesting, because it was like an evolution of this financial regulatory framework after the financial crisis, basically, because they were like, well, how do we fix the regulatory system to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again? One of the conclusions was that you allocate individual responsibility. So I think it's obviously something that is going to be resisted, and you've got to be careful about when you use it. But I do think questions of accountability on environmental harm and destruction are really important, and I think I think for organisations and companies who do carbon budgeting as well, that it's helpful as well, because I just think sometimes the board, it's good to have board level accountability, but everyone feels sort of protected by that in a way, don't they? Because it's collective, it's not individual.
But one of the biggest bits of accountability that I've seen CEOs have around the environment for the last year was and I lost count of how many CEOs told me, but they said, oh, my daughter's come back from her climate strike and she's asked me about what we're doing on carbon, said a boss of an airline. And that I was having dinner at Sustainable Aviation with the boss of an airport, and they went, oh, my son did exactly the same thing. And it was amazing how the personal pressure on those individuals from someone in their own family asking that difficult question was as important and as powerful as any of the lobbying campaigns done by NGOs or any of the media pressure done by other people. I think it's a good reminder that actually the thing that we as individuals, as human beings, find most powerful is still our own human experience. And if we can find a way of influencing that, then that certainly is a key to getting at decision makers in a way that you might not always be able to via other means.
And I think it's about finding what cuts through, isn't it? Because there's so much noise, and it's the personal stuff that cuts through. And it's, you know, like you say, it's having that direct question from someone you care about, you know, and it's feeling personally responsible and accountable. And it's like, how can you also engender that as politicians through the narrative you build up around the issues? Like, how do we, in a sort of post-COVID world, we'll hopefully post at some point in the future, you know, how do we kind of bring back all that feeling around the climate movement as well, to have it feel like it's the, you know, that generation in charge is being put on the spot again by younger generation.
It's kind of like you said earlier, Joe, in how that public perception, we have seen that change. You know, we've had so much direct action by XR, which has really brought those issues into the foreground of public perception and consciousness. And perhaps there is something to be said for that kind of financial disclosure in terms of our environmental impact, a bit like gender pay gap reporting. You have to disclose what you're doing, because as you've mentioned, we've got, and in Global Witness's report, it does show that we've got some of the biggest names in global finance: Barclays, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Santander, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. They're all funding companies directly or indirectly deforesting some of the largest rainforests in the world. So kind of as Luke mentioned with his pension scheme, you can inadvertently be contributing to that without really even realizing. I had a few more questions, but I actually want to just go to the audience, as we've got some great questions in the chat. So if you've asked a question, we're going to start with Holly Smith. Then I'm just going to unmute you. You're welcome to turn your video on too, or keep it off. And yeah, so we've got Holly Smith now.
Hi, thanks both of you for everything you just said, and also for all the work that you've been doing over the years on this issue. It's really great to see that it's come such to the forefront in the last couple of years. I know it was frustrating for a lot of us that it didn't get a lot of attention for a very long time. But I've got a question about the government's Dasgupta review, which showed what we have known for years, that biodiversity has a whole series of economic benefits. So 2 questions on that. Firstly, does the government publishing that show potentially positive movements within government and positive movements within the Tory party on their approach to nature? And secondly, I'm always sceptical when we link environmental arguments to economics, because I personally would prefer that we just talked about the benefits of nature for people and in its own right, rather than always having to go back to the economy. So also just a reflection on that question. Thank you.
Good. I mean, the Dasgupta review is the review's only been reported as interim stage at the moment, so we haven't got the final report, which includes any recommendations. So far, it's very much kind of like a process-led thing. Here's some stuff that we've been doing. I think the general approach that I worry about with government reviews around this one here is that if you were to ask 100 people that work in this area around that review, how many people would know about it, let alone wider than that, I think is very slight. There is a clear economic value from supporting biodiversity, and I think one of the difficulties around biodiversity in general and how we make sure it is an argument about preservation that works on the left and the right is that sometimes we're speaking at odds with each other about why it matters. So the right sometimes talks about biodiversity through the language of kind of like stewardship and the kind of like, you know, passing it down through generations, the kind of like, you know, more romantic kind of country life type perspective about biodiversity. And the left frequently talks about biodiversity through the prism of extinction and decline. And actually there's a truth about both those sides. And actually, you know, if you can measure it, you value it, and that is certainly true. And I think there is a merit, I think, for the, let's say, the Conservative Party. I think more the civil service machine, if I'm honest. I think I prefer the Dasgupta review and the focus on biodiversity value to be adopted by this Treasury more than just by random Tory MPs, if I'm honest. Because if we can start applying a value to biodiversity, a value to why preserving habitats, why preserving fragile habitats that sometimes can be expensive and could be replaced with an economic gain, supermarket, car park, factory, road, whatever it may be, might return more immediate gain, I think that would be helpful, because actually the idea of triple bottom line accounting, the idea of accounting for not only carbon but also for biodiversity, it's really hard to measure. And the difficulty in measuring it frequently means that it sits outside the decision-making processes that go through for measuring anything else. So you might get, what's the economic impact of this project? Well, you can get the economic impact, you can get the multipliers about job creation, you can look at the long-term skills pipelines, you can look at, the physical infrastructure, the capital gains, the regulated asset management cost of doing it, and then you get to the green bit, right? Which will probably have a chapter of its own, will probably have metrics that don't fit with the calculations of anything else, and will in itself be, my worry about those type of things is then it becomes a box ticking exercise of, yes, we have assessed the biodiversity bits, and do you know what? Those ancient woodlands that have 1,000 trees in, we'll plant 1,000 trees elsewhere. So therefore, 1,000 trees. Ignoring the fact that an ancient tree sequests and takes carbon at a greater level than a whole field of saplings. So I think it is necessary to have an element of biodiversity recognition within it. I think the bit that, without being a nerd on this, and I fear I'm stepping into nerdery, so forgive me on this one here, is that actually I think the review was designed to backfill an evidence gap that was required for the other COP that's going on, would have been going on this year, that's in China. So COP 15 on biodiversity, rather than COP 26 on carbon, was being held in China. Now, the political importance of that one is always lost. Everyone always focused on what was going on in Glasgow. Why? Because it's happening in the UK, so therefore something we care about it. B, it's about carbon. Carbon's more sexy. People talk about carbon. Biodiversity, isn't that just about pandas? And whether we care about rare newts and things. Well, actually, the biodiversity side, I think, is really important. And if you look geopolitically at the importance of that COP, well, this is the first time that China has ever held a conference of the parties, a UN conference of the parties. It is politically, for the Chinese leadership, so important about their role in the world, that they can't possibly see a failure to this meeting. Okay? Well, if you're taking all that in there, right, then that has to be a success. And they are driven to make this a success, frankly, with a level of drive that, Claire Perry could only dream of before she was sacked, leading COP26. And nobody knows about this meeting. Nobody knows about it. No one really knows about our negotiating objections about biodiversity. But actually, when we're looking at the loss of habitats, when we're looking at the huge level of extinction of not only plant, mammal, but insect species, when we're looking at the loss of forested areas, but also the other habitats that don't get the attention, mangroves, if you're looking at the growth of deserts and the loss of arable land and other kind of like productive land in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and the geopolitical impacts that come from the loss of those habitats and the biodiversity with it, is extraordinarily important. And I think, for me, the finer points of the government giving a toss about biodiversity and valuing it, yes, it's really important. It does need to fit into the decision-making processes. It's helpful having that. Will this produce it? No. It will say it's important. We should do some more work on it. So it's a useful signpost. But the signposting of the validity and the importance of biodiversity as distinct from carbon, because they're very much parallel, but they are very different, and the interventions might be green and nice along the way, but they are separate and need to be valued and resourced in slightly different ways. I think underlines just how important we need to be about the protection of biodiversity in general. Did I fall into nerdery too much then, or am I okay?
Nerds are always welcome. That's a great distinction, especially I think as many can observe that kind of rhetoric surrounding biodiversity from the sort of left-wing side of the spectrum and the right. It's very, very true, and something that doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Joe, did you want to come back on the kind of biodiversity point in question?
Yeah, just briefly. I think Luke's right to talk about the importance of this biodiversity COP, which was really, although they are different, for people active in this area, it was seen as a really crucial year that you have these two big COPs happening so close in time. And you know, we were talking to the UK government, and we've got staff in China as well. So we were very much trying to make the links between the two and use that momentum generated from them. And I don't know if I'm being controversial, but I think often with these big international summits, it's as much the momentum generated around it in the run up to it and how you can use that as a lever for policy and for good as it is to what's the finer detail agreed in the text, you know. And that was where, with the climate COP and the biodiversity COP, there was you know, in the UK and China, there was a lot of potential there to get movement in both jurisdictions on some of these crucial issues and really tell that story about biodiversity and about climate and make some of those links. So it'll be really interesting. You know, I hope we don't lose that. And I hope they are both able to happen in some form next year, which enables some progress on them. I think in terms of the Tory party on nature, it's been quite interesting. You know, trying to advocate to the Tories on this issue, because I think actually they're, like Luke says, they've got a different outlook and a different approach of things. But people like Zach Goldsmith, you know, is pretty passionate about nature. He might come at it from a different angle, and he might come up with different solutions. But there's definitely stuff to build on there. And you know, I do wince when it always comes back to what's the cost, and you know, tell us what the economic benefits are of these actions. And you know, as Holly said, it's really, you shouldn't have to quantify it, and it's unquantifiable. But if you have to do it to make the case in the system we're in, with the government we're in, then, you know, let's try and put a figure on it. But, you know, let's also be clear about all the limitations of that for the reasons that Luke pointed out. And, you know, that's the challenge of operating within the economic system we've got, isn't it? Is that we don't value all of those. But I do think, you know, the link between COVID-19 as this zoonotic disease and the links between destruction of biodiversity and exposing people to these animal-borne diseases, I mean, it does make another compelling case for action on biodiversity. So, you know, all is not lost. Let's hope that we get rescheduled COPs and a bit more renewed, you know, momentum on this issue to try and get some real progress.
Yeah, but that's
absolutely
massive hierarchy of biodiversity. You know, people like hedgehogs, squirrels, right? Insects, absolutely critical for our global thing. No one cares about insects. Have you seen a daddy longlegs recently? As an example of a species of insect that has seen massive population declines in the UK, when was the last time you saw a daddy longlegs? Right? And it's almost happened without anyone noticing. Right? And there is a massive hierarchy when it comes to biodiversity. And then also, I worry that sometimes there is a filter that gets put on the description of biodiversity protection overseas, depending on where it is. Is it in the global south? Is it in a developing nation? Is it in a country that we are favourable to or not favourable to at any one point? And I think there is we can't address biodiversity and how we approach it without addressing the fact that biodiversity has in itself become another front in some of the kind of international tensions that we have. But it's absolutely essential that we recognise it as an area of more importance, and you know, we need to do more of that.
I'm sure someone somewhere has written a doctorate thesis on the economic value of a daddy longlegs. So.
I'm sure. There's always someone. There's always one. I think, Joe, you know, you definitely made a very good point about we can definitely find it distasteful to have to quantify this value, but if we need to, in order to use it as leverage and to incentivize those that would then at least see it as an investment worth making, then possibly that's the way we have to go. The next question comes from Andrea Granger. So I'm just going to come to you. If you could unmute yourself. Still here? 1 second. There we go. Yep, Andrea, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks. So for Luke, so to date, Labour has called for a green growth strategy to combat our environmental crisis. The scientific reports I've read tell me this strategy doesn't have empirical backing and won't work. Is this something the Shadow Cabinet has investigated? And can you tell me how I could raise awareness of this issue in the Shadow team?
Great, thank you. I haven't seen those reports that say it doesn't have empirical backing, because what I do see is empirical reports showing that investment in green technologies has enormous economic benefits and multiplier effects in the wider economy. I think part of the green growth strategy needs to be driven by a vision about where we want to be and what is our moral purpose and clear objective, decarbonisation being one of those, a social agenda that says it can't just be a pursuit enjoyed by the affluent in society, so it needs to have a political focus on it. But it also, shamelessly, needs to have an economic side to it. We need to transition our economy from one that is has a greater reliance on carbon-intensive industries to one that doesn't. And that does mean a level of upfront capital investment, that does mean a level of upfront skills investment, but that investment will deliver benefits in the future. And if you take a step back from where we are at the moment as to how we are viewing green growth and how we view the importance of a climate-centered recovery from the virus, there will be very few opportunities across government for encouraging job creation in the next few years. You'll be hearing a lot about job protection. How do we protect certain industries? How do we protect jobs that we already have? Those sectors that can afford to create jobs and have the ability to create jobs will be few and far between, in the same way as we're defending other jobs. And so one of the challenges about how we have to get there is about transitioning from one type of economy to another, how we create jobs in another. But the creation of those jobs in that green economy has to be done in a way that takes working communities with us. And so there is a concern that I think was expressed during the general election, actually. And if I think about, I've got my lighthouse behind me that I represent on Plymouth Hoe. But if you go half a mile from where we are, where my picture's taken behind me, into a community called Devonport, which is bottom 4% of economic output areas in the country. So very, very poor. When I was talking to them about the green economy, about the green industrial revolution, there was a real concern about how it didn't include them. About how it was a sense of, well, you'll come away and take away my diesel van, and I need to get that to get to work. There's no bus that takes me to work. I can't afford an electric car. How's that going to work? If I get a green job making windmills rather than working, in offshore oil, that will pay me less. How's that going to work? So going along with this, we have to have an economic and a political and social case that has a transition of roles from a carbon-intensive one to another one that protects value within the employment sector, that protects people's incomes and livelihoods, but does so in a way that signposts and signals a shift away from one type of economic investment towards another, that incentivizes one to make it more preferable for folks to invest in, and disincentivizes through disincentives, regulatory pressure, consumer pressure, shareholder pressure from continuing activities in other areas. And I think we do need to make the case for this, but my fear about where it gets to is we also need an honest answer to the public where we say, well, actually, we are going to be spending money on this. Labour hasn't, under Keir, hasn't laid out our spending plans for the next general election, and we won't do for many years to come. But when we do, there will be no doubt in my mind that we'll be advocating spending money in areas that we weren't previously, that we'll be saying, well, actually, we will be spending money in this area here. This is investment. That money will need to be borrowed in order to do so. But the economic value of doing that, the job creation, the potential, the achieving our targets will make it worthwhile in a way that we're saying, well, actually borrowing to invest in carbon intensive industries, as this current government is doing at the moment, the subsidies and the stuff that the current government's doing is effectively borrowing as well, because we're not in surplus. So there is an economic and political case we've got to make for that. But that means, I think, building out this green growth angle so it doesn't feel like turn to page 12 to read our green growth plan. Unless green growth's on every single page of our manifesto, it's not going to be a coherent, comprehensive strategy. And I do worry about when we on the left, we that have a focus on the environment, on green issues, through our own advocacy of those issues, pigeonhole ourselves in a separate category or a separate validity to other investments and other activities. Well, the truth is we need to decarbonise everything. From the bus you ride to work, to the home that you live in, to your employment, every little bit of our economy, we have to get there, because we're talking about net zero now at some date to be confirmed, you know, whether, you know, and the government's got their objective. Well, that means removing effectively all the carbon, offset lots of it, but, you know, removing all the carbon. So we do need to have an honest conversation about where that's going, but we need to have that, especially with our voters and those voters that chose not to vote for Labour this time, because actually I fear that sometimes the pitch around where we are about green industrial revolution left some of those individuals behind, in a way that actually, if we had half an hour on the doorstep to explain and to advocate, it would be clear. But in a simple soundbite, it didn't land in the way that I think many of us would have wanted to. And that, I think, is a challenge of our communication, challenge of our economic model that sits behind it. But if there are things that say, you know, this is difficult and things like that, well, yes, it is difficult. It will be challenging. If it was easy, we'd have done it already.
Absolutely. We've got time for one more question, briefly from Laura. And also on that, so Laura, Jack and I will be co-editing a pamphlet or report that the Environment Network collectively is producing, kind of an alternative COP26 report, and would love to send you that and maybe, you know, start a conversation around that. We've got a lot of members contributing, and different people talking about everything from our emissions targets to international accountability. So yeah, Laura, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Really enjoying the event, guys. Thanks so much. Luke, as somebody else from a coastal community in Dover, where we've returned for Tories many times, and it breaks my heart every single time. Completely agree that we need to reach those areas more and kind of keep showing what a Labour government can do for them. My question is, 1.5 million people have gone an entire day without eating since the start of lockdown. How do we continue to put pressure on the government to find a solution to this hunger crisis, particularly to stop children going hungry and give people the support that they need?
Right. Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that question. The stat you used came from the Food Foundation report looking into the impact of the virus. It's one of the reasons, actually, that statistic and others around it, that we proposed in the agriculture bill that was on Wednesday last week, that we should get an emergency coronavirus food plan from government, setting out the real impacts of the coronavirus on food availability, on nutritional value, on the supply chain that gets food there. We put that to a vote. The government whipped its MPs to vote against it, and they won. The day after, if you look at the front page of the Times, there's a big splash from Boris Johnson saying, we need a plan for food. And he was approaching it from the angle that says obesity could be one of the characteristics that makes you more susceptible to the worst possible outcomes from coronavirus. And actually, we're still learning more about the virus and which groups and what conditions are especially prone to it. What we do know is that obesity could well be a contributing factor to it. And actually, the obesity crisis is something that has, you know, we've nibbled away at the edges, but we still haven't really got in there. Food poverty's risen hugely since the virus started. And one of the real big reasons for that is because of the huge number of people that have needed to transition onto universal credit. So it's the 5-week wait where you get no support, or it's the period immediately after your 5-week wait is complete where your loan that you are paid during the 5-week wait is deducted. It is the fact that there is a huge number of people that are basically in unsustainable financial positions because of the virus. And for me, food poverty has two sides of it. When we look at it as a food issue, I fear we can go down a rabbit hole about what the solution is. Because if we focus on it just as being a food issue, then it leads to this especially conservative narrative about making better food banks. Wouldn't it be better if food banks were readily available, more frequently available, make it easier for people to get it? Wouldn't it be easier if they were able to provide additional services along the way? And actually, those on the left, like ourselves, we need to be a firm that say, well, actually, Wouldn't it be great if people didn't need to go to food banks? Wouldn't it be great if people weren't in poverty and had the money to buy the food they need to feed their families? And this is where I think the virus demands that we take a really clear and distinct narrative on where the government is around food poverty. So I am we've got a weekly call with the food banks and emergency food providers, and a weekly call with the supermarkets, and a weekly call with trade unions that work in this sector. And the narrative that each of them produce is slightly different. But when it comes to poverty, what we mustn't do is get into a situation where we're managing the state of poverty rather than addressing the causes of it. And so, we have made the case, and Johnny Reynolds in particular has made the case for his 5 changes that he wants to see with immediate effect to universal credit. We've managed to get universal credit uplifted ever so slightly, increased, but we still have a 5-week wait. We still have deductions, even though government policy says there shouldn't be. In some cases, we still have difficulties with the 2-child limit. We still have difficulties with housing benefit along the way. And we still have the fundamental problem that people that are in food poverty don't have enough money. It's not they don't have enough food. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough money to pay their rent, to pay their bills, to pay their utilities, to feed, to clothe their kids. It's the lack of money that is the issue, not the lack of food. Now, that sits alongside specific coronavirus issues, such as the nutritional value of what some of our most vulnerable and shielded people are eating. And, as a child of the 80s, I bloody love Angel Delight, and Butterscotch Angel Delight is amazing, and they delivered an awful lot of that to people who are shielding. Now, that's great, but that's not a nutritional balanced diet, and we need to get a sense of where the nutrition sits as well as just providing food, because as we've seen from the obesity crisis, simply eating food, ignoring the nutritional value of it, isn't going to work. And we know that in our poorest communities, they have the nutritional intake and the nutritional intake of sugars, certain types of fats, and salts in particular is producing incredible health difficulties for those families involved. So we need to make the case that this is about a poverty issue, not just about a food issue, as we make the case for it. And tomorrow we've got DEFRA questions in the Commons, and I'll be there making the case around why we need that proper inquiry, that proper analysis of where we are on food. And we need to make sure that food remains a political issue. It goes back to what I said right at the start. And if we make food a political issue, not only are we dealing with low wages in the supply chain, not only are we dealing with crops rotting in the field, not only are we dealing with pensioners getting stuff that's either nutritionally or not culturally appropriate if they're shielding, but we can deal with the fact that there are, more people in poverty than ever before. And actually, one of the challenges that it would be worth people knowing about is since the virus hit, the average food bank has seen demand go up between 60 and 80%. 10% of food banks has seen demand go up by 200% since the virus hit. Now, bear in mind that a food bank is not like many people's perception is that you just go there instead of going to a supermarket. You only get a limited number of parcels every year. And the level of poverty and the story that tells about where our country is at the moment should alarm each one of us. And I think we need to make that place very clearly. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working with Johnny Reynolds in particular and Annalise to make the case that this is a, say food quietly, say poverty loudly answer to where we've got to get to.
Luke, expertly there, demonstrating the intersectionality between food, poverty and inequality. And you're absolutely right. There's the fact that the Universal Credit and DWP in general actually stopped labelling their food bank referrals so as to escape the quantification and statistics generation, for that to be something that would be ammunition against the Conservative Party. So I just wanted to come back on Jo for her sort of closing remarks and opinions on the last few things that have been said, and that vital question from Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. I think Luke did such a compelling case of making the case for addressing poverty and inequality as being the root to some of these problems of accessing food. In my local community, we've seen amazing mobilisation around food banks. We've got basically on every street in my area, you can drop food off outside someone's house and it will go to a food bank. And there's something, that it's like the best of times and the worst of times. You know, faced with this crisis, we're seeing really impressive mobilisation of the local community, but it's also it's heartbreaking. It's really frustrating because, you know, it's the Tory government that is, and I'm speaking with my Labour councillor hat on, not my Global Witness hat now, you know, that's created these conditions and has made these people so vulnerable, and, you know, that they're having to rely on handouts of food. So yeah, I don't have much to add on that, because I felt very much in solidarity with everything that we're saying. Yeah, I mean, just to add, really, I think we're at a crossroads, a fork in the road, really, in terms of where UK government goes next. You know, do we go for a kind of inwards national, you know, all about the economy, all about British jobs, you know, focus to the next stage of what comes next with COVID-19, or is this a moment they're going to use to kind of show global leadership, you know, work together with other countries to find a vaccine and to find some global response and tackle these big challenges? And I just think it's incumbent on all of us to make the case for it being the latter, and an outward focus, looking at the link to global supply chains, you know, because in the way COVID-19 has shown up so many universality of problems across the countries, across the world, you know. So this is a moment that we really need to kind of harness to deliver some global changes. And, you know, that probably would be my closing remark, really, and we're running over time. But I'm really grateful to you for having organised this opportunity. It was really, really interesting discussion.
Our pleasure. No, thank you so much, both of you, for attending tonight and giving us such an insightful discussion. I do apologise for running over time a bit. I've really enjoyed both of your very impassioned speeches and responses. Thank you also to all of our contributors and everyone who helped make this event a success and to happen. So yeah, we'll close there, but hopefully we'll be able to send you our report and keep the conversation going. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.